Chapter 1. Arya Blake adjusted the delicate lace veil on her best friend's head, stepping back to admire her handiwork. The private room buzzed with excitement, the air thick with the scent of roses and champagne. Tonight was the bachelorette party, a rare evening where Arya allowed herself to step away from the relentless pace of the fashion world. "Arya, you've outdone yourself," Lila gushed, her eyes sparkling. "This is exactly what I needed before the big day." Arya smiled, her mind already drifting to the looming deadlines awaiting her at the office. But tonight was for Lila, and she intended to make it unforgettable. "Ladies," Arya called out, clinking her glass to gather attention, "I hope you're ready for a night to remember." The room erupted in cheers, the women raising their glasses in unison. As the night unfolded, laughter echoed, and stories of college escapades were recounted with fervor. Arya felt a warmth in her chest, a reminder of the bonds that had weathered time and distance. Just as the evening seemed to reach its peak, the door swung open and a man stepped in. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that hinted at European craftsmanship, he exuded an air of confidence. His chiseled features and piercing blue eyes drew the attention of every woman in the room. Arya arched an eyebrow, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "Well, well, looks like our entertainment has arrived," she quipped, eliciting a chorus of giggles from the group. The man's brow furrowed briefly, but he quickly masked it with a charming smile. "Ladies," he began, his voice smooth as velvet, "I apologize for the intrusion. I seem to have taken a wrong turn." Arya, emboldened by champagne and the night's festivities, sauntered over. "Nonsense, since you're here, why not join us? We could use a bit of masculine energy." He chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. "I wouldn't want to impose." "Oh, but we insist," Leela chimed in, her cheeks flushed. "It's not every day we get a surprise guest." The man glanced at his watch, then back at the expectant faces. "Very well, but just for a moment." As he settled into the plush armchair, the women peppered him with questions, their curiosity piqued. Arya observed him closely, noting the ease with which he deflected personal inquiries, steering the conversation back to the group. "You're quite the enigma," Arya mused, leaning against the piano. "Do you have a name, Mr. Mystery?" He met her gaze, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Alexander," he replied simply. "Well, Alexander," she said, extending a hand, "welcome to the party. I'm Arya." Their hands clasped, and for a brief moment the noise of the room faded, leaving just the two of them locked in an unspoken challenge. Before the moment could deepen, Arya's phone buzzed insistently. Glancing at the screen, she saw the dreaded words, "Urgent, client meeting in 30 minutes. Her heart sank. "I'm so sorry, ladies, but duty calls." A collective groan rose from the group. "Always the workaholic," Leela teased. Arya shrugged apologetically, then turned to Alexander. "It was a pleasure meeting you, even if briefly." He stood, taking her hand once more. "The pleasure was mine, Arya." Impulsively, she reached into her clutch, pulling out a crisp bill. "For the unexpected entertainment," she said with a wink, pressing it into his palm. Alexander stared at the money, a bemused expression crossing his features. Before he could respond, Arya was already halfway out the door, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm against the marble floor. As the elevator doors closed, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The image of Alexander's piercing gaze lingered in her mind, a tantalizing mystery she had no time to unravel. Back in the suite, Alexander looked down at the bill in his hand and chuckled softly. "Well, that's a first," he murmured, slipping it into his pocket. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and he found himself intrigued by the fiery woman who had mistaken him for someone else. Chapter 2. The next morning, Arya sat at her desk in the sleek, glass-walled offices of Elysian Fashion House, sipping on her third coffee of the day. The city skyline stretched beyond her window, but her mind wasn't on the designs sprawled before her. It was on him. That stranger. Alexander. She couldn't shake the image of his amused smirk when she had handed him that tip. The realization of what she had done made her cheeks burn even now. "God, Arya, focus!" she muttered under her breath, snapping the sketchbook shut. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, grateful for the distraction. Her assistant Mila poked her head in, her eyes wide and excited. "Arya, you're not going to believe this. The William Corporation's CEO is here, Alexander William himself. He's meeting with the board right now." Arya blinked, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Wait, what?" Alexander William? Why would he be here? Mila shrugged. Rumor is they're considering a major buy-in, or worse, a takeover. Arya's stomach twisted. The William Corporation was notorious for taking over struggling companies, gutting them, and turning them around at the cost of everyone's jobs and creative freedom. Do we even need an investor? Arya asked, though she knew the answer. Their last few collections hadn't performed as well as hoped. Investors were circling like sharks. I don't know, Mila said, eyes gleaming with excitement. But God, Arya, if you see him, he's so hot, like ridiculously. Arya gave a distracted nod, her mind racing. It couldn't be. The man from last night? That Alexander? No, surely not, but her gut told her otherwise. Thanks, Mila, she said, standing abruptly. I need to check something. Leaving her office, she made her way down the corridor, heels clicking against the polished floor. Through the glass walls of the conference room, she saw them, the board members seated stiffly. And at the head of the table, Alexander, cool and composed, speaking with calm authority. Her heart dropped. It was him. He wasn't just some random stranger she had accidentally tipped. He was the Alexander William, one of the most powerful, ruthless businessmen in the city, and he was staring right at her. His gaze was sharp, predatory, but there was a glint of amusement there too, as if he was enjoying watching her reaction. Their eyes locked, and Arya forced her expression to remain neutral. Don't let him see you squirm. But her body betrayed her. Her pulse raced, and her throat went dry. Without breaking eye contact, Alexander gave her a slow, knowing smile. Her stomach twisted with a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and something she wasn't ready to name. Spinning on her heel, she stalked back to her office. Mila followed, wide-eyed. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Arya closed the door behind them and leaned against it, exhaling a long breath. Has not just some CEO, she muttered, mostly to herself. Has that man, from last night? Mila blinked. Wait, the stripper guy? Arya groaned. I thought he was a stripper. Oh my God, Mila, I tipped him. Mila burst into laughter, clapping a hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. You tipped the billionaire CEO? She gasped between laughs. Arya glared. It's not funny. He probably thinks I'm a complete idiot. Mila wiped tears from her eyes, still chuckling. Or maybe he thinks you're bold and unforgettable. Either way, girl, this is something. Arya paced the room. What if he's here to take over? What if I've given him a reason to fire me the second he gets control? Mila tilted her head thoughtfully. Or maybe he's here because he wants to see you again. Arya shot her a look. Don't be ridiculous. But even as she said it, her mind flashed back to the way his eyes had lingered on her, as though he was studying every detail of her. Before Mila could say more, Arya's phone buzzed with a message. Meeting with Alexander William. Conference room A, 15 minutes. Her blood ran cold. You've got to be kidding me, she whispered. Mila peeked at the screen, her mouth dropping open. Guess you're about to face Mr. Stripper CEO himself. Arya rubbed her temples. This is a nightmare. But deep down, there was something else. A spark of anticipation, excitement she couldn't admit out loud. Straightening her shoulders, Arya squared her jaw. All right, if he wants to play games, he's about to meet someone who won't play nice. As she walked out of her office toward the conference room, she silently vowed to keep her cool and fight for her company, no matter how distracting Alexander William might be. Because if he thought she was just another woman he could charm and buy out, he was about to get a serious wake-up call. Chapter 3. Arya's heels clicked sharply against the polished floors as she approached Conference Room A, her heart pounding louder with every step. She adjusted the sleeves of her cream blouse and straightened her pencil skirt, forcing a mask of calm professionalism over the storm brewing inside her. Through the glass walls, she could see the board members already gathered, but her eyes were instantly drawn to him. Alexander William. He sat at the head of the table, exuding effortless authority in a dark, tailored suit, his watch glinting under the light. His gaze was trained on some document in front of him, but the moment Arya stepped inside, his head lifted, and their eyes met. For a moment, the room felt too small, the air too thick. Arya pasted a polite smile on her lips, refusing to be the first to look away. Miss Blake, the chairman greeted, standing slightly as she entered. Glad you could join us. Please take a seat. Arya nodded gracefully. Of course. Sliding into the chair opposite Alexander, she deliberately avoided looking directly at him. She could feel his eyes on her, though, like a touch that burned through her clothes. "Shall we begin?" the chairman continued, gesturing toward Alexander. "Mr. William has taken an interest in our recent portfolio. We were just discussing the future prospects for Elysian." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together in a relaxed but commanding pose. "Indeed," he said smoothly, his voice like velvet and ice. "I've been following Elysian's work for some time. Innovative designs, creative direction." His gaze flickered to Arya, a spark of amusement in his eyes. "Though some of your management choices are interesting." Arya's jaw clenched. "Oh, he was going to play that game. Interesting enough to make you crash a private party, Mr. William?" She shot back smoothly, tilting her head, a challenge in her eyes. The board members exchanged confused glances. Alexander smirked, clearly enjoying this little dance. "Sometimes, Miss Blake, the best way to learn about a company is to meet the people behind it, in unconventional settings." So he wasn't going to admit anything. Fine. Two could play that game. "Well, I hope what you saw didn't disappoint," she said, her tone sharp but polite. "On the contrary," Alexander murmured, eyes locked on her. "It was illuminating." The chairman cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to steer the conversation back on track. "Mr. William has expressed interest in potentially investing or merging with Elysian," he explained. "Given his corporation's reach, this could be a valuable opportunity." Arya's spine stiffened. Merging. She knew exactly what that meant. Takeover, under the polite guise of partnership. "With all due respect," Arya began, forcing herself to remain composed, "Elysian has always prided itself on independence. Our designs, our voice. We're not a brand that can be molded to fit a corporate mold." Alexander gave her a slow, deliberate smile, as if he expected this answer. "Miss Blake, independence is admirable, but it doesn't pay bills." A sharp pang shot through her chest, but she didn't let it show. "Neither does selling your soul, Mr. William." There was a beat of silence. The chairman looked between them, clearly sensing the tension. "Perhaps we should focus on what collaboration could look like, rather than control." Alexander's gaze never left her. "I'm always open to negotiation," he said smoothly, "provided both parties understand who holds the stronger position." Arya's fingers tightened around her pen, so he wanted to flex his power. "And yet, strength isn't always about who has deeper pockets," she said coolly. "Sometimes it's about who has more vision." Alexander's lips twitched in what could almost be amusement. "We'll see about that." As the board members continued discussing numbers and projections, Arya could barely concentrate. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. He thought he could just waltz into her life, buy out her company, and intimidate her? Not happening. When the meeting finally adjourned, people began filing out. But Arya made no move to leave, and neither did Alexander. He was watching her, expectant. As the door clicked shut behind the last board member, Arya stood, gathering her papers with precise movements. "Quite the performance in there, Mr. Williams," she said, not looking at him. He rose from his seat smoothly, moving to stand dangerously close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, fresh and dark like cedarwood and spice. "I could say the same, Miss Blake." She turned to face him fully, her chin lifted. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I won't let you destroy what I've built." Alexander smirked, stepping even closer, his voice low and smooth. "Oh, Arya, I'm not here to destroy. I'm here to take what I want. And right now." His eyes roamed over her, unapologetically. "You're at the top of that list." Her breath caught, but she masked it with a sharp laugh. "You think you can buy me too, Alexander?" He leaned in so close she could feel the heat of his body, his voice a dark whisper. "I've bought entire empires, sweetheart. Don't tempt me to add you to my collection." Arya's heart pounded so loud she was sure he could hear it, but she refused to back down. "You'll find him not for sale." With that, she turned on her heel, walking out of the room with her head high, even as her pulse raced and her skin tingled from his nearness. Behind her, Alexander chuckled softly. "We'll see about that, Arya." As the door closed behind her, Arya exhaled shakily. She knew one thing for sure. This was war. And if Alexander William wanted to play with fire, she'd make sure he got burned. Chapter 4. Arya walked into the studio the next morning, her heels echoing sharply on the concrete floor. The set was already buzzing. Photographers setting up, models rehearsing their poses, assistants running back and forth with racks of clothes. This photo shoot could make or break the launch of their new collection. Everything had to be perfect. Still, her thoughts refused to focus. They kept circling back to him. Alexander William. She could still feel his breath on her skin, hear the low rasp of his voice in her ear. I'm here to take what I want, and right now you're at the top of that list. Arya shook her head as if to chase the memory away. No distractions, she whispered to herself. Morning, Arya, Mila chirped, approaching her with a tablet in hand. Here are the finalized shots for today. We need to run through them with the models in 15. Perfect. Let's get started. But as Arya flipped through the images, Mila suddenly stiffened beside her. Arya. What? She asked distractedly, still scanning the shots. Mila leaned closer, her voice hushed but urgent. Don't freak out, but look who's here. Arya's heart sank. She didn't need to look. She knew. Still, she turned, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Alexander casually strolling into the studio like he owned the place. He was dressed impeccably, of course, in another custom suit that hugged his tall, broad frame perfectly. His sharp eyes surveyed the room, finally landing on her, and when they did, a slow, knowing smirk tugged at his lips. You've got to be kidding me, Arya muttered under her breath. As if sensing her frustration, Mila leaned in again. Should I have security escort him out? She whispered, only half joking. Arya straightened her shoulders, forcing calm. No, I'll handle him. Mila gave her a supportive nod but shot Alexander a wary glance as she walked off. Arya waited as Alexander approached, refusing to move an inch. I didn't realize we were open to the public today, she said coolly when he stopped in front of her. Alexander chuckled, hands sliding into his pockets. I make it a habit to check on my investments, Arya. Her jaw tightened. We are not your investment. Not yet. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. But soon. She met his gaze evenly, determined not to let him get under her skin, even if her pulse betrayed her. Is that why you're here? To remind me how powerful you are? He smirked. No, actually, I'm here because I was curious. Curious about what? Alexander's eyes swept over the studio, then returned to her face. About how a woman who runs a fashion empire can look like she hasn't slept a night since we met. Arya's cheeks flushed with heat and anger. I don't have time for games, Alexander, she said sharply. We're working. If you have no official reason to be here, I suggest you leave. But instead of leaving, Alexander leaned against a nearby table, clearly planning to stay. Actually, he drawled, I heard you're short a model today, Arya blinked. What? One of your male models canceled. Last-minute emergency, I was told. She glared at Mila across the room, who gave her a helpless shrug. Clearly, Alexander had done his homework. So? Arya snapped. Alexander's smirk deepened. So I'm offering to help. You need a man to wear those suits? Why not? Me? Arya stared at him, stunned. You think this is funny? On the contrary, he said smoothly. I'm quite serious. Unless, of course, you're afraid of what might happen if we spend a little more time together? Her jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Fine, she bit out before she could think better of it. If you want to embarrass yourself in front of the camera, who am I to stop you? She turned away before he could see the flush creeping up her neck, barking orders to her team. Mila? Get him fitted. Someone, get the charcoal suit ready. The team scrambled into motion, confused but intrigued. Mila leaned in as she handed Arya the next schedule on her tablet. Are you sure about this? She whispered. I'm not, Arya muttered. But if he wants to play, I'll play. And I'm going to make him work for every second he's here. Within minutes, Alexander was back, now wearing one of the signature suits from their upcoming line. And damn it, Arya's stomach did a strange little flip at the sight. He looked incredible. The suit hugged his broad shoulders, his powerful chest, and tapered perfectly to his waist. He looked like he belonged on every billboard in New York. And that was infuriating. Alexander caught her staring and gave her a slow, wicked grin. Like what you see? Arya huffed and turned away. Don't flatter yourself. The photographer called them to start, and Arya folded her arms, watching with narrowed eyes as Alexander took his place in front of the camera. She had to admit, he was a natural. His movements were smooth, confident, and effortlessly captivating. The camera loved him, and worse, so did her body, even as her mind screamed to stay away. Tilt your chin. Perfect. Hold that, the photographer directed, snapping away. As the shoot went on, Alexander's eyes kept flicking to Arya between poses like a silent challenge. By the end, when the photographer called a break, Alexander walked straight over to her, unbuttoning the suit jacket as he approached. "So?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "How did I do, boss?" Arya swallowed, fighting to keep her expression neutral. "You'll do," she said tightly, stepping around him, but he caught her wrist gently, halting her. "You can push me away all you want, Arya, but we both know this isn't over." She looked up at him, their faces inches apart. "Maybe not," she said softly, her eyes flashing. "But don't think for a second you'll win." He smiled, tilting his head. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't intend to win." He leaned closer, his lips brushing her ear. "I intend to own you." Arya yanked her hand free, her heart pounding furiously as she stepped back. "We'll see about that, Mr. William." And with that, she turned and walked away, knowing full well this war had only just begun. Chapter 5. Arya sat alone in her office, staring out of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden hues over the buildings, but she hardly noticed. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk, her mind spinning. Alexander William. Every time she thought she had a grip on the situation, he found a way to slide deeper under her skin. Showing up at her photo shoot, modeling like he owned the runway, and the way he had whispered that possessive promise in her ear. "I intend to own you." Arya shook her head sharply. No, she wouldn't let him get to her. She had worked too hard to let a man, even a billionaire in a perfect suit, ruin everything she had built. A knock on the door broke through her thoughts. "Come in," she called without turning around. Mila stepped inside, holding a tablet in her hands, her eyes cautiously studying Arya. "So, how are we handling Mr. William now? Because the team is still buzzing about him. And honestly, half the models think he's the hottest thing to ever step in front of a camera," she said with a nervous laugh. Arya turned from the window, her expression sharp. "We handle him like any other corporate shark. We outsmart him." Mila blinked. "Outsmart him? Yes." Arya's voice was firm. "If he thinks he can walk in here, dazzle everyone, and make us fold, he's wrong. Hez expecting me to get flustered and play defense." She stood up, walking around her desk to face Mila fully. "It's time I stop reacting and start making my own moves." Mila's lips twitched in amusement. "You've got a plan, don't you?" Arya smirked, her confidence beginning to return. "I always do." She took the tablet from Mila and scrolled through their upcoming schedule. "Call a press event," she said decisively. "I want to announce a bold new collaboration with one of our biggest designers. Something that will make headlines and show that Elysian isn't up for grabs." Mila's eyes widened. "A press event? You think that'll be enough to keep him at bay?" Arya's smile turned sharp, predatory. "It'll be enough to remind him that I'm not some woman he can push around. And if he wants to fight for control, I'll make sure he has to do it in public, where I control the narrative." Mila grinned. Now that's the Arya I know. But before Mila could leave, Arya's phone buzzed loudly on her desk. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Arya hesitated for a second before answering. "Hello? Miss Blake." The deep, smooth voice was instantly recognizable. Alexander. Arya straightened, glancing at Mila and gesturing for her to stay as she put the call on speaker. "Mr. William," Arya said coolly. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" From the other end, Alexander's low chuckle made her grip the edge of her desk tighter. "Pleasure, indeed. I wanted to congratulate you on today's photo shoot. Quite a success, wouldn't you say?" "It was," Arya agreed, her tone frosty. "Though I don't recall asking for your participation." "Ah," Alexander said, amusement thick in his voice. "But you didn't stop me, did you? In fact, I'd say you rather enjoyed having me there." Arya's cheeks flushed, but her voice remained calm. "Don't flatter yourself." Alexander hummed thoughtfully. "Regardless, I'm looking forward to working together, Arya. Or should I say, taking over?" Mila's eyes shot to Arya, her face pale as she listened. "You're assuming too much," Arya said smoothly, her pulse racing. "You'll find I'm not as easy to conquer as your boardroom pawns, Mr. William." There was a brief pause on his end. "You're right," he murmured, his voice suddenly softer but more dangerous. "You're not easy. That's what makes you interesting." Before Arya could respond, he added, "But here's the thing, sweetheart. I always get what I want." "We'll see about that," Arya said icily, ending the call before he could get the last word. Mila stared at her, wide-eyed. Okay, so what now? Arya exhaled, pacing the room. Now we move fast. She turned back to Mila, her eyes sharp with determination. Draft the press release for the collaboration announcement. I want it on every major platform tomorrow. And set up an exclusive interview. It'll speak directly to the press about Elysian's future. No mention of him, but make it clear we're not looking for outside help. Mila grinned, energized by Arya's fire. On it. As Mila left, Arya stared out the window again, her mind racing. Alexander William thought he could play with her, that she'd be another deal he could wrap up and add to his empire. But he didn't know her. Arya Blake wasn't just fighting for her company, she was fighting for herself, and she wasn't going to lose. As the city lights flickered to life and the sky darkened, a slow smirk tugged at Arya's lips. Chapter 6. Arya kept her head high as she walked off the stage, her heart pounding, her body buzzing with adrenaline. Applause still echoed behind her, but her mind was already spinning, calculating her next move, because she knew Alexander wouldn't take her public clarification lying down. She didn't even get halfway across the room before a hand clamped firmly around her wrist, stopping her in her tracks. Not here, Alexander, she said sharply, not even turning to face him. His grip only tightened slightly, his voice low and dark near her ear. You made a mistake tonight. Arya slowly turned to look at him, her eyes hard as steel. No, I made a statement. Elysian isn't for sale. Alexander's jaw ticked, but his smirk remained in place, a dangerous, knowing look that sent a chill down her spine. You think that was a statement? He sneered. All you did was give me a reason to tighten the noose. She yanked her wrist from his hold. If you think threatening me will work, think again. He leaned in, his ice-cold gaze locking onto hers. This isn't a threat, Arya. It's a promise. She felt her pulse race as his words settled deep, sending a warning clear as day. You've impressed me. I'll give you that. You've got fire. But don't forget who you're dealing with, Alexander continued smoothly. I don't lose, ever. Arya's eyes narrowed. Maybe it's time you did, he chuckled coldly, no humor in his expression. Careful, sweetheart. You're playing a game in my world. And in my world, I always get what I want. She folded her arms tightly across her chest. Not this time. His smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. We'll see, because whether you like it or not, I'm buying Elysian. I'll own it. And when I do, he stepped closer, towering over her, his voice low and deadly. I'll own you too. Arya's breath hitched, but she kept her mask on, not letting him see her crack. Keep dreaming, Alexander. He smiled darkly. Dreams? No, Arya, this is real, and I'm going to enjoy watching you bend before me. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, furious and shaken. Mila hurried to her side a moment later. What did he say? You look like you've seen a ghost. Arya swallowed hard, straightening her back. He's coming for Elysian, and for me. Mila's eyes widened. What are you going to do? Arya's jaw set, her gaze hardening as she stared at Alexander's retreating figure. I'm going to fight him, and if he wants a war, he's got one. But as much as she wanted to believe she had the upper hand, something in Alexander's dark gaze stayed with her, a warning that he never makes promises he doesn't keep. And for the first time, Arya realized she might be in deeper than she thought, because Alexander William wasn't just playing for business. He was playing for her, and he played to win. Chapter 7. Alexander stood in his penthouse office, towering over the city that glittered below, like it belonged to him, because in many ways it did. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the glass of his whiskey tumbler, eyes sharp and dark as they scanned the reports laid out in front of him. Elysian Fashion House, a beautiful little company, and now a company that would belong to him. He smiled coldly to himself, the image of Arya Blake flashing across his mind. The way she had stood up to him at her event, fire blazing in her eyes, defying him in front of everyone. He admired her boldness, but that didn't mean he would go easy on her. If anything, it made him more determined to break her. She had challenged him, and no one challenged Alexander William and walked away unscathed. His phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up lazily. Speak. His right-hand man, Simon, spoke on the other end. Sir, we've confirmed the key investors in Elysian. 2 of their largest backers are shaky. They're worried about returns on the last collection. Alexander's smirk deepened. Perfect. Good. Reach out to them. Make them an offer. Double what they've invested in exchange for their shares. Simon hesitated. If we pull those shares now, Elysian's value will tank publicly. It'll look like a collapse. Alexander's voice turned colder, sharper. That's the point. I don't just want her company, Simon. I want her begging me to save it. I want her on her knees, admitting she can't win. There was silence on the line for a moment. Understood, sir. Alexander hung up, swirling the amber liquid in his glass as he leaned back in his leather chair, thinking. Arya Blake. So damn proud. So damn sure she could stand up to him. But she had no idea what he was capable of. He had crushed bigger companies than hers, built empires on the ashes of others. And yet, she was the one who had managed to crawl under his skin. Her sharp mouth. Her fire. The way she refused to bow to him, even when he towered over her, whispering promises that would make lesser women crumble. She was a rare kind of woman. But even rare women could be broken, and he would be the one to do it. Finishing his drink, Alexander stood, slipping into his tailored suit jacket before grabbing his keys. Tonight, he would make his next move. By the time he arrived at Elysian's building, the office was nearly empty, all except for one light glowing in Arya's office on the top floor. Of course, she was still working. He smirked to himself, stepping into the private elevator and pressing the button for the top floor. When the doors slid open, she was sitting at her desk, completely focused on her laptop. Focused, but tense. She sensed him the moment he stepped inside. Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, standing up as though she could physically block him from invading her space. He shut the door behind him, taking his time as he walked toward her, his eyes cold and sharp. "Just thought you should know. Your investors are about to pull out." Her face paled, though she tried to cover it quickly. "What are you talking about?" He smiled darkly, placing both hands on her desk and leaning in, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his gaze. "They're pulling out, Arya. I made them a better offer. Without them, you'll have nothing left to fight me with. Elysian will be mine before the end of the week." Her eyes burned with rage and something else. Fear. Good. "You're playing dirty," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. He tilted his head, smirking. "Sweetheart, this isn't playing dirty. This is business. You made this personal when you tried to challenge me." She swallowed hard, but to her credit, she didn't back away. "You don't have to do this, Alexander." His gaze darkened, his voice dropping lower. "Oh, but I do? You think you can stand up to me? You think you'll just walk away because you glare at me across boardrooms?" He circled the desk slowly, moving behind her, speaking near her ear. "I always win, Arya. You'll learn that. You'll come to me when this place is burning, and you'll ask me to save it." She spun to face him, her eyes flashing. "You think I'd ever beg you for anything?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You will, and when you do, I'll make sure you never forget what it costs to defy me." For a moment they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Her chest was rising and falling quickly, her fists clenched at her sides. But Alexander? He was calm, cold, completely in control, exactly how he liked it. Finally she whispered, her voice soft but filled with venom. "I hate you." He stepped closer, invading her space entirely, their bodies almost touching. "You'll hate me even more when you realize I'm the only one who can save you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, trembling, and knowing she was running out of options. As he stepped back into his car, Alexander's phone buzzed. A text from Simon. "First investor confirmed. The others are leaning. Elysian will fall soon." Alexander smirked as he stared out at the city. Arya was strong, but she wasn't stronger than him, and soon she would be his, whether she wanted to be or not. Chapter 8. Arya sat at her desk, staring blankly at the screen in front of her. The numbers swam together, refusing to make sense. Her phone vibrated again, another email from one of their investors reconsidering their position, as if that wasn't code for "we're backing out because of Alexander William." She ran a hand through her hair, fighting the rising wave of panic, threatening to suffocate her. Everything was falling apart. Everything she had built, every sleepless night, every sacrifice was crumbling under Alexander's calculated assault. She glanced at her reflection in the dark window, seeing a woman she barely recognized, tired, beaten, but still standing, barely. A knock sounded on her office door, sharp and decisive. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of calls and fighting for her company. The door opened, and as soon as she saw him, her stomach twisted. Alexander stepped inside, calm and composed as ever. Dressed in another perfect suit, the very image of ruthless control. "What do you want?" she asked, standing to face him, though her legs felt weak beneath her. He closed the door quietly behind him, slipping his hands into his pockets as he looked her over. "You already know why I'm here, Arya. If you came to watch the company burn, you're a little early." "We're not dead yet," he chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "No, not yet, but soon." Her throat tightened, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I won't let you do this." He took a step closer, eyes glinting with dark amusement. "You're out of options, Arya. You know that. The investors are pulling out, your funds are drying up, and suppliers are getting nervous." She swallowed hard, refusing to let him see her fear. "I'll find a way." "You won't." His cold certainty shook her more than she wanted to admit. "But I can give you one." Her heart stilled. "What?" Alexander stepped closer, his voice low, deliberate. "A deal." She stared at him, her pulse thudding in her ears. "What kind of deal?" He smiled, slow and ruthless. "It'll save Elysian. I'll stop the investors from pulling out, inject fresh capital, stabilize everything." Arya's breath caught. For a moment, hope flared, before reality sank in. "What do you want in return?" she asked bitterly. His eyes darkened, watching her like a predator. "You." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "What?" she whispered. Alexander took another step closer, invading her space completely. "I want you, Arya. No contracts, no negotiations. You work for me. You do what I say. You answer to me. Only me." Her heart pounded in her chest. "You want me to sell myself to save my company?" His lips twitched into a smirk. "Call it what you like. You'll belong to me, and I'll take care of Elysian." She stared at him, anger, fear, and helplessness swirling in her chest. "You're disgusting," she spat, though her voice shook. Alexander's gaze remained cold and unmoved. "No, unrealistic. You need me, Arya. You're running out of time, and soon you'll have nothing left. So, I'm offering you a choice." Her throat tightened painfully. "You could have just bought the company. Why this? Why me?" she demanded, her voice raw. He leaned in closer, his voice a low whisper that sent chills down her spine. "Because I want to break that fire in your eyes. I want to own the woman who dared to defy me." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And if I say no?" Alexander's smile was cold as ice. "Then watch it all burn, Arya. Watch everything you built crumble. And when you're standing in the ashes, you'll wish you had taken my offer." Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms to keep herself from breaking in front of him. "You're a monster," she whispered. "No," he said softly, tilting her chin up so she was forced to look into his eyes. "I'm the man who wins. Always." She jerked her face away, her body trembling with rage and helplessness. "Think about it," Alexander said, straightening. "I'll give you until tomorrow. After that, the deal's off the table, and so is Elysian." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, tears threatening to spill, her entire world crumbling around her. And for the first time, Arya didn't know how to fight back. Chapter 9. Arya sat at her desk, fingers trembling as she flipped through the latest reports. The numbers stared back at her, cold and merciless. Another investor gone, another supplier backing out. Her phone buzzed again. "We regret to inform you we are terminating the contract effective immediately." Another one. She let the phone slip from her hand, falling onto the desk with a soft thud. Her shoulders slumped as her eyes burned. Everything was slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't stop it. But it wasn't just Elysian. It was him, her ex. The man who once claimed to love her now wouldn't leave her alone. He had been sending messages, waiting for her outside her apartment, making sure she knew he could still reach her anytime he wanted. She had hidden it from everyone, especially Alexander. But deep down, she knew Alexander suspected something. Still, she wouldn't go to him. Yet. Arya wiped her eyes roughly, forcing herself to stand and straighten her blazer. She had survived this long. She could survive longer. Or so she told herself. But as she stepped out of her office, the whispers around her felt like knives. Everyone knew. The fall of Elysian was being watched by the entire industry, and behind every polite smile she saw the vultures waiting to pick apart what was left. She pressed her lips together, her heels clicking with false confidence as she walked to the elevator. The doors slid open, and there he was, Alexander, leaning casually against the back wall like he had all the time in the world. Impeccable suit, cold, sharp gaze, like a king surveying a kingdom he was about to claim. Her stomach twisted. "Arya." His voice was smooth, calm, but she heard the steel beneath it. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, stepping in despite herself, hitting the ground floor button harder than necessary. He smirked, tilting his head. "Checking on my future company." Her jaw tightened. "You're wasting your time." "Am I?" he murmured, eyes watching her with unsettling focus. Silence stretched between them as the elevator began its descent. She could feel his gaze on her, like he could see every crack in her armor. "You're running out of time, Arya," he said softly, dangerously. "You're fighting a battle you've already lost." She glared at him, anger flaring even though her heart was racing. "I haven't lost? You want me to beg you? It's not going to happen." Alexander's smirk didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "No, not yet, but you will." The elevator doors slid open and she stormed out, refusing to look back. He let her go, for now. Hours later, Arya sat in a boardroom, trying to convince 2 remaining investors to stay. Her voice was steady, her presentation flawless, but they were already gone. She could see it in their eyes. When the meeting ended, she stood alone in the boardroom, staring out at the night skyline. Her phone buzzed again. "Still ignoring me? You'll regret it, Arya. You know I always find a way to get what I want." Her chest tightened painfully. She locked her phone and stuffed it in her bag. She wasn't going to cry. Not now. Later that night, Alexander sat in his office, watching the footage Simon had collected. Video clips of Arya's ex lurking near her apartment, following her car, standing outside her office building like he owned her. Alexander's jaw clenched, the glass in his hand cracking slightly as his grip tightened. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice cold enough to freeze steel. Simon hesitated. "Weeks, maybe months. She's been hiding it." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "No more. He won't get near her again." "What do you want done?" Alexander leaned back, his gaze sharp and lethal. "Make it clear to him who she belongs to. And if he comes near her again, I'll deal with him myself." Simon nodded and left quietly. Alone, Alexander stared out the window, swirling the drink in his hand. Arya wanted to fight him. She wanted to act strong. But she couldn't fight this alone, and he wouldn't let her. If she thought he was going to watch her fall apart, she was wrong. He would own her first. And once she belonged to him, no one, not her ex, not anyone, would ever touch her again. But first, he needed to let her break. Because only when she had nothing left would she finally come to him, where she belonged. Chapter 10. Arya sat alone in her dark apartment, knees drawn to her chest, her phone clutched tightly in her trembling hand. The message from her ex still glared at her like a venomous snake. "You think anyone can protect you? You'll come back to me. You always do." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had fought for so long, for her company, for herself. But now, she was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't let her go. And Alexander? Her chest tightened painfully as she thought of him, the man who had ripped her life apart, only to offer her a twisted form of salvation. "You'll belong to me, and I'll save you." His voice haunted her. As much as she hated him, he was right about one thing. She had no other choice left. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't her ex. It was Alexander. "You have until morning to decide. After that, there's nothing left to save." Her hands shook as she stood, pacing the room. Could she really do this? Could she give herself to him, fully, completely, and lose everything she had fought for just to stay alive? But what was the alternative? Be destroyed by her ex, lose Elysian, and watch her world burn. Her stomach twisted. By the time dawn began to break over the city skyline, she had made her decision. He sat behind his massive desk, cold and composed as always. The city spread out beneath him, but his attention was fixed on his phone, waiting for the inevitable. When the call finally came, his lips curled into a dark smile. "Arya," her voice was hollow, broken. "I'll do it." Alexander leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "You'll do what?" A long pause. "I'll give you what you want. Me." His eyes darkened, satisfaction swirling with something sharper, something more dangerous. "Good girl." Arya swallowed on the other end of the line, her voice cracking. "I want a contract." "No contract," Alexander said smoothly, cutting her off. "This isn't business, Arya. You'll belong to me, completely." She took a shaky breath. "You said you'd save Elysian, that you'd stop the investors from pulling out. And I will. But in return, you'll do what I say. When I say it, no questions, no limits. Silence. Then softly, "Fine." Alexander's smile sharpened, victorious. "Come to my penthouse tonight, and don't make me come get you." Without waiting for her response, he hung up. Later that night, Arya stood in front of Alexander's penthouse door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She had dressed simply, black slacks, a silk blouse, but she felt naked under the weight of what was about to happen. Taking a shaky breath, she raised her hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and there he stood, tall, powerful, and dangerously composed. "Come in," Alexander said, stepping aside. She walked in, her hands clutching her purse tightly, her eyes darting around his sleek, modern space. "Drink?" he asked, already walking to the bar. She shook her head. "No." He poured himself a glass of whiskey, taking a long sip before turning to face her. "Take off your coat." Her fingers trembled as she slipped out of her blazer, folding it over her arm. Alexander's sharp gaze raked over her body, making her skin prickle. "You made the right choice," he said, setting his glass down. "You'll thank me for this one day." She let out a shaky laugh. "I doubt it." He smirked, walking toward her slowly until he stood inches away, towering over her. "Do you know why I wanted you, Arya?" She glared up at him. "Because you want to own me. You want to prove you can break me." He tilted his head. "Partly, but it's also because I don't let anyone hurt what's mine." Her brows furrowed in confusion. "Your ex won't touch you again." Arya's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Alexander leaned in, his voice cold and sharp. "You think I don't know? I know everything about you, Arya. I know he's been following you, threatening you." Her heart thudded painfully. "You knew, and you still did this to me?" He smirked darkly. "'Cause you wouldn't let me help you any other way. You'd rather drown than ask me to save you. So now you don't get a choice." Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away. "So this is your way of protecting me? Owning me?" Alexander reached out, running a finger along her jaw, tilting her face up. "If that's what it takes to keep you safe, then yes." She swallowed hard, hating the way her body shivered at his touch. "You'll hate me for a while, Arya, but at least you'll be alive to do it." His words were soft, but the steel beneath them was clear. "You belong to me now, and no one will ever hurt you again." She let out a shaky breath. "What happens now?" Alexander's eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction. "Now you start learning what it means to be mine." He stepped back, gesturing to the couch. "Sit, we'll go over what I expect. And Arya?" She turned slowly to look at him. His dark eyes burned into hers. "Don't think about running, you won't get far. And if he touches you again, hell wish he never crossed me." As she sank onto the couch, her body trembling, Arya realized this wasn't just about business. This was war. And now, she was his most valuable possession. And Alexander? He planned to own her, protect her, and destroy anyone who tried to take her away, no matter what it cost. Chapter 11. Arya woke in Alexander's penthouse, her body wrapped in soft silk sheets that felt more like a cage than comfort. The room was cold, sleek, and beautiful, just like him. She sat up, glancing around, disoriented for a moment before the weight of reality settled on her chest. She belonged to him now, and today would be the first day she faced that truth. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she forced herself to stand. If he wanted to control her, fine. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Not yet. A knock sounded on the door before she could reach it, and then Alexander stepped in without waiting for permission. Dressed sharply in a dark suit, his eyes were as cold and calculating as ever, but there was a glint of something darker beneath the surface, possessiveness. "Good. You're up." She stood straighter, folding her arms tightly. "What do you want?" he smirked. "To get you ready for the day. Your life doesn't stop because it's mine now." Her jaw tensed. "Don't remind me." Alexander walked toward her, his eyes raking over her like he was memorizing every inch of her body, like she was his property. "I'll remind you every day, Arya, until you accept it." She glared at him but said nothing. "You'll be attending meetings with me today," he continued smoothly. "Publicly. Everyone will know you're under my protection now." Her heart thudded painfully. "I don't need your protection." He stepped closer, invading her space as he tilted her chin up between two fingers. "You do. And you'll take it, because I say so." Her eyes burned with anger, but she didn't pull away, because she knew she couldn't. "Get dressed. I had something brought up for you." He let her go and gestured toward a sleek black dress laid out on a chair. Elegant, powerful, exactly the kind of thing Alexander would pick to mark her as his. "I'm not wearing that," she said, crossing her arms. He arched a brow, amused. "You'll wear what I give you. Or do I need to remind you again who owns you now?" Her cheeks flushed with rage and humiliation. "Fine," she snapped, grabbing the dress and storming into the bathroom. An hour later, Elysian boardroom. The reaction in the office was immediate when Arya walked in at Alexander's side. Gasps, whispers, and wide-eyed stares followed them as they strode down the hall, him calm and in control, her stiff and guarded. Alexander didn't give anyone a chance to speak. He led her straight to the boardroom, where the remaining investors and executives sat waiting. Once inside, Alexander took the head seat, her usual place, and gestured for her to sit beside him, like a prize on display. Her stomach twisted, but she obeyed, sitting down stiffly as the others exchanged confused glances. Alexander folded his hands, glancing at the room coolly. "As of today, I am personally backing Elysian. Consider your investments safe, under my control." A ripple of murmurs swept the room. One of the senior executives cleared his throat. "Mr. William, does that mean you've fully taken over?" Alexander smirked. "It means Elysian won't fall, and Arya will remain in her role, under my direct supervision." He turned to her with a dark, satisfied smile. "She works for me now." Heat rushed to Arya's face as the room turned to stare at her, questions in their eyes. But Alexander wasn't done. "Anyone who has an issue with that can leave now. Otherwise, we proceed." No one moved. Of course not. Alexander was now the most powerful man in the room, and Arya was right where he wanted her. His office. After the meeting, Alexander led her back to his private office. The moment the door closed, Arya spun on him, her eyes blazing. "You humiliated me," she snapped. He leaned casually against his desk, watching her with calm amusement. "I told you, Arya, you belong to me now. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." She glared at him. "You could have handled that differently." Alexander pushed off the desk and walked toward her, backing her up until she was pressed against the wall. "I don't do different. I do what works. And showing the world you're mine keeps you safe." She swallowed hard, hating the way her body reacted to him. "What happens when my ex sees all this?" she asked quietly. Alexander's eyes turned deadly. "That's the point. Hell no, you're not alone anymore." "And if he doesn't stop?" Alexander's lips curved into a dark, dangerous smile. "Then he'll destroy him." She shivered, both from fear and the raw intensity in his voice. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. His hand came up, cupping her cheek, almost gently, but with a firm grip that told her there was no escape. "Because I protect what's mine." She stared up at him, heart pounding, as he leaned in just enough to make her breath hitch. "And you, Arya, you are mine now. Every inch of you." His thumb brushed her lower lip, lingering there as her eyes widened, caught between fear and something darker, something she didn't want to name. "Get used to it," Alexander whispered before pulling back and walking away, leaving her trembling against the wall. Chapter 12. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of Alexander's penthouse, but Arya didn't feel its warmth. She stood in front of the mirror, carefully applying makeup to hide the angry bruise blossoming on her cheekbone. Her ex had caught her outside her apartment when she went back to grab a few things. She thought she could slip in unnoticed. She was wrong. Her hands trembled as she dabbed on more concealer, her mind spinning with what he had said. "You think he can protect you forever? You'll come back to me. You always do." A chill ran through her. She shouldn't have gone back. She knew Alexander would be furious if he found out, and she wasn't ready to face what that would look like. But she had to work. She had to show up and pretend nothing was wrong. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her bag and headed out. Arya kept her head down as she walked through the office, praying no one would notice. But as soon as she entered the boardroom for the executive meeting, Alexander's sharp gaze locked onto her. His body tensed the moment he saw her. She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she slipped into her seat, focusing on the documents in front of her, as if that would make everything normal. But Alexander wasn't a man to let things slide. "Arya, my office. Now." The room fell silent. Everyone's heads turned. Her stomach dropped. She stood shakily, feeling all the eyes on her as she followed Alexander out of the room. The door slammed behind her the moment they entered. "Take off the makeup," he ordered. his voice low and dangerous. She swallowed. Alexander, take it off. Her hands shook as she reached into her bag and pulled out makeup wipes. Slowly, she began wiping her face until the bruise was visible in full. Alexander's jaw clenched so tight she thought he might break his teeth. He stepped closer, his voice a cold, controlled whisper. Who did that? She hesitated. Arya, it doesn't matter. Who did? He snarled, grabbing her chin between his fingers, forcing her to look up at him. My ex, she whispered, her throat tightening. The air between them grew suffocating. Alexander's eyes were deadly now, a storm swirling behind his calm mask. You went back there? She nodded, trying to hold back tears. I told you not to go back. I needed my things. His grip tightened slightly before he let her go, pacing the room like a caged predator. You think I'm going to let him get away with touching what's mine? Her heart pounded. Alexander, he spun on her, eyes burning with fury. No, this ends now. Before she could react, he grabbed his phone and barked orders into it. Find him, today. I want to know where he is, and I want him watched. He hung up and turned back to her, walking slowly until he was right in front of her again. You're not going back there, Arya. You're staying with me. And he's not getting near you ever again. I can't just move in here forever, she snapped, her voice breaking. He cupped her face, his touch now gentle but firm. You're not going anywhere. Do you understand me? Her lips trembled. You think I'm going to let the world think you're not protected? He whispered. Arya stared up at him, realizing what was coming. Alexander, don't... He smirked coldly. Oh, I will. The next thing Arya knew, Alexander had called a press conference, dragging her along. As they stood together in front of the flashing cameras, Alexander's hand settled firmly around her waist, possessive, unmovable. Reporters were buzzing with excitement, whispering about what was going on. Alexander didn't hesitate. I called you here today to make something clear, he said, his voice loud and cold. Arya Blake is mine. From this day forward, anyone who looks at her, talks to her, or even thinks of harming her will answer to me. The room fell dead silent. Arya's cheeks burned, but his grip only tightened. If anyone has a problem with that, Alexander continued, eyes glinting, I suggest you reconsider. Cameras flashed. He had done it. He had publicly claimed her, owned her, for the whole world to see. As the press swarmed them with questions, Arya turned to him in shock. Why would you do that? She hissed. Alexander leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear. Because now he knows you're not alone. And because now there's no turning back for you, Arya. Her breath caught. You belong to me. And I'll make sure everyone, including him, understands that. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like chains. As he led her away from the cameras, she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. She wasn't sure if she wanted to escape anymore. Chapter 13. His Forever. The night air was heavy as Arya stood by the window in Alexander's penthouse, watching the city lights blink far below her. Everything had changed in a matter of days. Her ex was still out there, a looming shadow. Her company, Elysian, was no longer hers. It was Alexander's. Making it clear who was in control, the kiss was fierce, like he was branding her, staking his claim. When he finally pulled back, her head was spinning. You belong to me now, Arya. Say it! She shook her head weakly, but he gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. Say it. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would break her ribs. I belong to you, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. His smile was dark, triumphant. Good girl. Alexander and Arya walked into the ballroom together, every eye on them. She wore a stunning black dress that clung to her curves, chosen by him, her hand resting on his arm as if she had never been anywhere else. He leaned down as cameras flashed around them. Smile, sweetheart. You're mine now. The world should know. She forced a smile, but her heart twisted. Because she was his now. Fully. Completely. That night, as they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, holding her tight against him. You're safe now, he murmured against her ear, and you'll never leave me. You know that, right? Arya closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. But deep down, she knew he was right. She was his, and she would never escape him. Not because he wouldn't let her, but because she didn't want to anymore. Chapter 14. The city lights twinkled against the dark sky as Arya stood on the balcony of Alexander's penthouse, her arms wrapped around herself. The cool breeze kissed her skin, but it did little to soothe the storm of emotions swirling inside her. So much had changed in so little time. She had fought him, fought his control, his dominance, his sharp tongue, and relentless pursuit. But now, he had destroyed every threat to her, including her ex, and instead of feeling trapped, she felt safe. The door behind her opened quietly, and she knew it was him without turning. She felt him before she even heard his steps. "It's cold out here," Alexander said softly, but there was no sharpness in his voice tonight, only quiet concern. She smiled to herself, hugging her arms tighter. "I'm fine." He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her from behind, pulling her firmly into his chest. The warmth of his body enveloped her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she relaxed. "Don't lie to me, Arya," he murmured against her ear. "You don't have to be strong anymore. Not with me." Her throat tightened at his words. "You fought so hard to protect everything," he whispered, kissing the side of her head. "But now, I'll protect you. Always." Arya closed her eyes, leaning back against him, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong against her back. "You scare me," she whispered. Alexander stilled behind her, his grip tightening slightly. "Because I'm ruthless?" She shook her head, turning in his arms to face him. Her eyes searched his, soft and vulnerable. "No, because you make me feel safe, and I've never felt that before." His eyes softened in a way she had never seen, and she knew this side of him was only for her. "You don't have to be afraid, Arya," he said, cupping her cheek gently. "You're mine, and that means no one will ever touch you again. No one will ever hurt you." A tear slid down her cheek, but it wasn't from fear this time. It was from relief. Alexander leaned in and kissed the tear away, his lips lingering on her skin. "It'll destroy anyone who ever tries." She nodded, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the strength beneath his shirt. "I know. You believe me now?" he asked, his voice softer, vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. She looked up at him, her heart finally breaking free from all the walls she had built. "Yes," she whispered. "I believe you." A small smile touched his lips, not the cold, calculating smirk he showed the world, but something real. "Good." Arya reached up, her fingers brushing his jaw. "I was so afraid to let you in." He leaned into her touch, his hand coming up to rest over hers. "You're safe now. With me, you'll always be safe." She smiled softly, tears in her eyes. "I don't want to fight you anymore, Alexander." His eyes darkened with something raw, something that wasn't just possession but deep, undeniable love. "Then don't," he whispered, tilting his forehead to rest against hers. "Let me love you, Arya. Let me take care of you." Her heart swelled at his words. For the first time she realized that all his darkness, all his ruthlessness, it was for her. To protect her, to make her his. "I want that," she whispered. "I want you." Alexander pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, searching for the truth in her words. "You mean it?" She nodded, smiling as tears fell freely now. "I love you." His breath caught, and for a moment the powerful man, the king of ruthless takeovers, looked completely undone by those words. "Say it again," he whispered, his voice rough. "I love you, Alexander." A groan escaped his throat as he crushed her to him, capturing her lips in a kiss that was nothing like before. Not claiming, not controlling, but loving. His lips moved over hers with a tenderness that made her heart ache, his arms holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "You have no idea what you do to me," he murmured between kisses. "I'll love you like no one else can. You'll never need anyone but me." She smiled against his lips. "I only need you." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands cupping her face like she was fragile, though she knew he saw her strength too. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling. "You're mine, Arya, in every way." She nodded, smiling softly. "And you're mine." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "I've always been yours, sweetheart. You just didn't know it." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the city lights fade into dawn. For the first time, Arya felt free, not because she had escaped him, but because she had stopped fighting what was always meant to be. She belonged to him, and he belonged to her. Chapter 15, 6 months later. Arya sat by the large window of Alexander's, now their penthouse, sunlight pouring in as she sipped her tea. The city was alive beneath them, but for once, she felt peaceful. Her life had changed so much. She glanced down at the tablet in her hand, scrolling through the latest designs for the new Elysian collection. Her company was thriving again. But this time she wasn't fighting alone. Alexander had kept his word. He had poured his power, his money, and his ruthless skill into saving Elysian, but he had never tried to take it away from her again. Instead, he had become her fiercest protector and her greatest supporter. A soft smile played on her lips as she heard the door open behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. She could feel him before she saw him, the way his presence filled a room like he owned the world. "Morning, sweetheart," Alexander murmured, his voice softer now than it had ever been when they first met. Arya turned to smile at him. "Morning." He walked over, still looking sharp and powerful in a suit, though his tie was loosened, his dark eyes focused solely on her. He leaned down to kiss her gently on the lips, slow and lingering. "You were up early," he said, sitting beside her and pulling her legs over his lap like he always did. She grinned. "Working on the new collection." Alexander raised a brow, smirking as he brushed his fingers along her calf. "You work too much. You're supposed to let me take care of you, remember?" She laughed softly. "You do, but I like working. Besides, it's ours now, not just mine." He smiled at her words, pride flashing in his eyes. "You've come a long way, Arya," he said, watching her carefully. "I'm proud of you." Her heart swelled. "I've come a long way because you wouldn't let me fall." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I wouldn't let anyone take you from me, not even yourself." She leaned into his touch, her smile soft. "I know." He studied her for a long moment, and then his voice dropped lower, more serious. "You still think about him sometimes, don't you?" Her smile faded slightly, but she nodded. "Sometimes. But it's different now, because I know he can't hurt me anymore. You made sure of that." His jaw tensed for a moment at the memory of her ex, but when his eyes returned to hers, they were filled with nothing but fierce devotion. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel that fear again." Arya cupped his cheek, her thumb brushing over his sharp jawline. "You already have." He kissed her palm before pulling her closer. "Come with me," he said suddenly, standing and taking her hand. She laughed. "Where?" "Just trust me." Arya followed him to the rooftop terrace, where a private table was set for two. Champagne already chilling, roses adorning the space. Her heart skipped a beat. "What is this?" she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. Alexander turned to her, holding both her hands now, his face serious but his eyes warm. "You gave me everything, Arya. You gave me a reason to fight, a reason to be more than just ruthless. You're my life now, and I want to give you everything in return." Her eyes filled with tears. "Alexander," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath caught. Opening it, he revealed a stunning diamond ring, elegant, timeless, perfect. "Marry me, Arya." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she smiled, her hands covering her mouth. "You already own me, remember?" she whispered, laughing through her tears. He grinned, but there was nothing but sincerity in his voice when he said, "Maybe, but I want to love you openly. I want the world to know you're not just mine. You're my wife, my queen." Arya's heart felt like it would burst. "Yes," she whispered, nodding as she threw her arms around him. "Yes, I'll marry you." Alexander wrapped his arms around her tightly, burying his face in her neck, holding her like he never wanted to let go. "You've made me the happiest man alive, Arya," he murmured, "and I'll spend every day showing you what that means." She pulled back slightly to look at him, her smile radiant. "I love you." His eyes softened in a way only she ever saw. "I love you too, sweetheart, more than anything." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Arya realized that this was what she had always been searching for. Love that was fierce, protective, and all-consuming. Not a prison, not chains, but a man who would fight the world for her. A man who had already fought for her. And as Alexander kissed her again, slow and full of promises, Arya knew one thing for sure. She wasn't his prisoner. She was his queen. Chapter 16. The sun streamed softly through the large windows of their new home. A stunning private estate outside the city, surrounded by gardens that Arya had fallen in love with the first time Alexander brought her here. Now, it was theirs. A home, not just a fortress. Arya stood in front of the mirror in their grand bedroom, adjusting her silk robe. Her hand brushed over her slightly rounded belly, the secret she had been holding onto for weeks. His child. She smiled softly to herself, but before she could get lost in thought, she felt strong arms slide around her waist, pulling her back into a solid chest. "You're up early," Alexander murmured against her ear, his voice still husky from sleep. She relaxed into his hold, smiling as his hands splayed across her stomach, lingering just a little longer, as if he could already sense what she hadn't told him yet. "Couldn't sleep," she whispered. He kissed her neck, resting his chin on her shoulder, watching her reflection in the mirror. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his dark eyes studying her carefully. She bit her lip, nervous but filled with warmth at the way he read her so easily now. "I've been thinking." "About what?" Turning in his arms to face him, her heart pounded in her chest as she gazed up at the man who had once been her enemy, now her husband, her protector, and the love of her life. "About us. About the future." He frowned slightly, tilting her chin up with a gentle hand. "What about it?" Taking a deep breath, she placed her hand over his. "Alexander, I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world went still. Alexander's eyes darkened, his jaw tensing, not with anger, but with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Say it again," he whispered, as if needing to be sure. "I'm pregnant," she said softly, tears filling her eyes. His reaction was unlike anything she expected. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly like he never wanted to let go. "You're carrying my child," he murmured against her hair, his voice raw and filled with emotion. She nodded, smiling against his chest. Pulling back slightly, Alexander cupped her face, his thumb brushing away the tear that slipped down her cheek. "You've given me everything, Arya. First yourself, now this." "I was scared to tell you," she admitted, her voice trembling, his brows furrowed. "Why? You're mine. Everything you are, everything you have, belongs to me, including our child." She let out a soft laugh, wiping her tears. "Because you're still the man who takes what he wants. And this is something we never talked about." He smirked slightly, but there was tenderness in his eyes. "Sweetheart, I wanted this the moment I realized you were mine. And now, you've made me the luckiest man alive." His hand slid to her belly, resting there protectively, a small smile tugging at his lips. A rare, soft expression she had come to love. "Our baby will know one thing, Arya," he said quietly, "that their father will destroy anyone who dares threaten them, or you." Her heart swelled. "I know." Alexander leaned down, kissing her deeply, slowly, like she was the most precious thing in the world. When he pulled back, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "You've made me ruthless for you, Arya, but for this baby, it'll become something even more dangerous if I have to." She smiled, her heart full, her hands resting over his as they cradled her stomach. "I don't want dangerous," she whispered playfully, leaning her forehead against his. "You'll get dangerous," he whispered back with a smirk. "But you'll also get a man who will love you more than life itself, and love this child even more." A tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it was from pure happiness. "I love you, Alexander. I love you too, my queen," he whispered. "Forever." Months later, the estate was quiet as Alexander walked into the room where Arya sat, now heavily pregnant, resting on a chair in the garden. Without a word, he sat beside her, pulling her gently into his arms, her head resting on his chest. "You're supposed to be working," she teased, smiling up at him. He chuckled, kissing her temple. "And leave you alone? Never." Arya looked up at him, love shining in her eyes. "You're not the same man I met," she whispered, running her hand along his chest. He smiled darkly. "I'm still ruthless, still dangerous." She laughed softly. "Not with me." He cupped her face, looking into her eyes. "No, never with you. You're the only one who's ever tamed me, Arya. And you're the only man I'll ever love." As the sun set around them, casting golden light over the garden, Alexander held her close, one hand on her belly, feeling their child kick beneath his palm. "Our family," he whispered, "forever." And Arya knew, without a doubt, that no matter how dark or ruthless Alexander was to the world, for her and their baby, he would be everything. The end. Written by Maria. Thank you all for taking the time to dive into this story with me. Your love and support mean everything, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. This journey wouldn't be the same without you, and I'm so grateful to share these stories with such amazing readers. Stay tuned for more passion, more love, and more unforgettable moments. Until next time, see you in the next one. With love, always, Maria.